And we have a speaker who was a massive hit for our Need for Speed event earlier in the year that Shan alluded to. Nick Winkleman, Head of Athletic Performance and Science for the Irish Rugby Football Union. He's a primary role there to oversee delivery and development of strength and conditioning and sports science across all national men and women 15s and 7s programs and the provincial teams. Prior to working for Irish Rugby, Nick was Director of Education and Training Systems for EXOS, formerly Athletes Performance, which is located in Phoenix, Arizona. As Director of Education, Nick oversaw development and execution of all internal and external educational initiatives. And as a performance coach, Nick oversaw the speed and assessment component of the EXOS NFL Combine Development Program, supporting many athletes across NFL, MLB, NBA, the national sport organizations, and US military. Nick completed his PhD through Rocky Mountain University of Health Professions with a dissertation focus on motor skill learning and sprinting. And he's an internationally recognized speaker on human performance and coaching science with multiple peer-reviewed publications and book chapters, alongside his own textbook, The Language of Coaching, the Art of and Science of Teaching Movement. I've been looking forward to this, especially today, but I'm looking forward to hearing the language of coaching and becoming a communication athlete. Nick, over to you.
Mutchy, thank you so much. And for everyone who is joining us after what it sounds like to be a very long day, I appreciate that you still have some attentional reserve left. Now, when Mutchy invited me back to present this evening, he did so with the understanding that we wanted to build on the concepts and the presentation that were presented in the Need for Speed conference. Now, I'm acutely aware that some of you may have been at that, hopefully all of you, but if not, that might mean that we are skipping ahead, especially if you haven't seen me present in the past or if you haven't read The Language of Coaching. So if that is the case, and you'll see the links at the end, the vast majority of my presentations, including an equivalent one that I would have done for, again, this group at the Need for Speed conference, is readily available in multiple forms and versions on my YouTube channel. And so that's all free, open source. So in skipping ahead, and even if you weren't there for that, I don't think you'll find it very difficult to catch up, so to speak, but I will be taking liberties in making reference on the assumption that some of the core science and the foundational principles around communication health and verbal fitness is at least some level understood, if not theoretically, at least intuitively in practice. So with that, I will still be doing a bit of a review to lay the foundation, but this being analogized to the dessert, I certainly have some goodies on offer that are very much so in the spirit of practice and practicality, and I want to make sure the vast majority of our time is dedicated to those. So to begin, I'd like to get your own, let's say, verbal engine going. And I'd like to invite you in this case to use the chat box just to share any insights to the following prompt. And that is to describe in your own experience what excellent verbal coaching and communication looks like within a training and rehab session. So you might comment on the timing, the content, right? The type of information you present, anything that you feel is relevant. If we were going to watch an elite coach / communicator / practitioner, what do we feel excellent verbal coaching and communication looks like within that training and rehab session? So again, I would invite you to use our chat feature. I have it opened up. And we have Mutchy opening up straight to the point with blast like a rocket as a cue. And yeah, that is the panacea of all movement. Just tell them to blast like a rocket. It will clean up everything. Job done. So here from Heather, communication that is perceived to be successful. And I'm assuming in that case, right, this is communication that is understood and leads to a successful outcome on the side both of the athlete or patient and certainly the practitioner or physio delivering it. Beautiful. Imagine you are a spring. So Rebecca, I believe, is coming in with some cues here. We'll leave this open for another 30 seconds. Again, anything that you feel outlines excellent verbal coaching, either literally, sure, an example of a cue, or more broadly, you might say something like, trying to minimize information overload. Here we have Hannah, using words that the athlete would understand and are relevant to their sport. Beautiful, Hannah. Adam, excellent verbal communication would be something that only needs to be said once for the athlete to understand it. So brevity being our best friend. How do we get the most out of the least, right? Superhuman calm and perfection. Use cues that match the group or individual. Example, soft like a ninja, or pretend you are pissing over a wall for a pelvic tilt. I find it quite interesting that already we see quite literally some colorful language that is prompting and probing our visual engine. Thank you, Mutchy. Those are very easy for us to see. And the beauty here is already, even in some of the initial snapshot responses, you have foreshadowed easily 90% of the presentation I'm going to go through. And so the reason I want to highlight that fact is I find again and again, whether I'm talking to physios, sport coaches, strength coaches, personal trainers, athletes, or mom and dad, is that a lot of this stuff is intuitive. We know effective communication when we hear it because, as I believe Hannah said, it works. Right? We immediately understand it. We get this sense that it's about to work. And then in physical application, in the case of, let's say, a coaching cue, we see it come to life with better movement. And as I'm certain I likely said in our last time together, we want to move this ability from chance to choice. We want to make this invisible sound wave that we call communication something visible that we can define at the habit or behavioral level. And once we can define the components, broadly speaking, of effective communication, then we can start to modify. We can start to build. We can start to nudge, just like any other habit. And so tonight, my hope is that, again, we can define some of these key ingredients of excellent or effective coaching and communication, right, on a path to becoming a communication athlete. And we can also give you some practical application of how those things come to life. So to begin with, I don't believe we went through this last time, but if we did, it's still very good from a review perspective. What we have on this slide here is what I like to call our communication landscape. And what a communication landscape is, very simply, is the two streams of communication that show up and that are relevant day in, day out when we are on the training floor, when we are working with that healthy athlete or that athlete who's in a rehabilitation status. These two forms then create, if you would, the DNA of what it means to be a communication athlete. Now, last time we talked about one of these movement streams. It's the movement stream that is presently highlighted. And that's this idea of becoming effective at movement communication, literally communicating movement, speaking from your athlete or your patient's language locker, such that they can apply what you say to their movement so that they move better in the moment, but notably so that they move better long term. And we call that learning. But the reality is there is a person inside of that player, right? There is a human being inside of that athlete. And if we want to be able to get to that human, if we want to get to that person, we have to be able to speak their language. Many of the comments were pointing to that in our chat box exercise earlier. And that is wrapped up more generally in what we refer to as your skill in the interpersonal communication space. Can you speak human? Can you connect with them as a person, understanding their lived experience, their backgrounds? Even someone earlier in the chat said, hey, how can I make the exercise I am teaching relevant to their sport? That means I know something about their sport and I know something about them in terms of that sport. But we now go to Mutch's examples of the analogies, landing soft like a ninja or pissing over the wall to help with the pelvic tilt for those that find that colorful language acceptable. Well, that's going to assume that a person knows that a ninja lands softly, or maybe has experience pissing in public over a wall, or at least can imagine as such. And so what we're pointing to there is, even if you're going to use visual language, analogical language, which as it happens is one of the key strategies we're going to talk about tonight, you need to know that that person has some familiarity with that. It's something relevant to them, possibly even an emotional connection. And all of that is going to be born out of you knowing the patient, knowing the athlete. And so what we see within the context then of a training session is both of these forms of communication play back and forth. They volley back and forth throughout a session, such that when someone shows up, I would argue a good, healthy communication habit is the first thing you talk about is the person. And so there's some form of rapport building. Maybe they're a younger athlete. Hey, how are your finals going? Maybe they've had an illness in the family. How's your grandparent doing? And so you're connecting with them as an individual. And then you slowly transition. How are you feeling today? Right? Maybe, hey, what's our focus? Remind me what we learned last session that you personally want to bring into this session. So you're working with them at the individual, the personal, the interpersonal level. Inevitably, you will likely transition to the so what of the day. So what are we going to do? And that's where you start talking session preview. And I always call this the WWH. What are we going to do? Why are we going to do it? And how are we going to do it? It's our own wrestling syndicate, the WWH. But from there, likely you'll go back and forth, talking to the person, getting feedback, understanding their sense of how something is going. And then you get into the movement. You get into coaching mode, using that coaching communication loop. And back and forth you go. Now, this presents something that's very rigid, as if literally you have to go back and forth. That's just for the effect of a nice, pretty slide. The reality is this back and forth is non-linear. Right? Sometimes you might spend a lot of time talking to the person, especially early on when you're getting to know them. Over time, you might be able to cut the small talk, and most of your communication is in and around the movement. But what I want you to hear me say more than anything else on this slide is the following. Your interpersonal communication skills are you going to the quarry. It's you digging down into the raw material of what makes this person tick, their lived experiences, their memories, their likes and their dislikes. And all of these things come out of not forced discourse, but natural discourse of getting to know someone. And what I want to yell loud and clear is we want to use that raw material we mine for through interpersonal communication and avail of its benefit when we are teaching movement, such that we are able to use your client's own narrative, thoughts, perceptions, and preferences when we are crafting and curating language meant to help them move better. And so more than anything, this slide is meant to show the dynamic interaction of getting to know the person at an interpersonal level and having the skill set to do that, to build rapport and relationship, but then being able to recognize within that mind information its relevance when you are wrapping it into a coaching cue or a debrief discussion. And I think that will come through loud and clear with the two notable strategies we're going to talk about today. So that as a background and a backdrop, yes, I'm going to continue to talk about movement communication, but I hope I've clearly and emphatically conveyed its dependence on interpersonal communication. And maybe in a future session, we can talk a bit more about that interpersonal communication directly. So that's our first, let's say, point of review, the broad ingredients that dynamically interact when it comes to teaching movement. We would have now transitioned into our second point of review, and that's the anatomy specifically of communicating movement. And we would have spent a decent level of time talking about this idea of the coaching communication loop, which simply outlines, if you would, the verbal stages, the verbal and visual stages of teaching a movement initially, which is what I refer to as the long loop, and teaching a movement for which the patient or athlete is already familiar, what we call the short loop. And so it's quite intuitive, so I'm going to be brief here, and it's in review. When I'm teaching something for the first time, I'll provide a level of verbal description. I'll provide a level of visual demonstration, the order of which is up to you as indicated by our circular arrows. How much verbal information you're going to give is likely dependent on their ability to process visual information and vice versa. Inevitably, if not at the first rep, inevitably, you're going to provide a cue. That coaching cue is a pair of glasses. It's a lens with which to view the movement differently. It's the address in the GPS, in the sat nav, that helps guide the movement holistically. It's the single conductor that coordinates a symphony of musicians, just like a single cue is meant to coordinate a symphony of joints and muscles. It is one, it is singular. It is the central focus guiding the movement. Once that cue is delivered, it is uploaded and applied literally while the athlete does it, while they perform the movement pattern. So an example for a sprint might be focus on exploding off the ground, or blast off the blocks like a rocket, to use Mutch's earlier example. That is applied when they are doing it, which is the central source and canvas for learning to take place. And then the final thing we do is we debrief it. And as you'd likely recall, but if you don't, the debrief, focusing on communication here, is meant to give us one of three outcomes. Either that we, A, reiterate the cue, we repeat the cue because it worked. B, we refine the cue, meaning the meaning was there, it was targeting the right movement error, but the words did not work. And so I need to tinker with those words. I need to refine those words to get to a cue that provokes a visual, that engenders a focus that actually helps the person move better. Or C, I have to retire the cue because either it backfired, it failed, it didn't work, or I've been using it for a long time, its shelf life has expired, and I need to come up with something new, even if it fundamentally means the same thing. And so as you can see here, I use all 5 stages, more or less, when I'm initially laying down a concept and teaching a movement for the first time. But once we're in the heart of it, it's cue, do, debrief, cue, do, debrief. Now, let me be very clear. This in no way suggests that you have to debrief every rep and set or have to give a cue before every rep and set. Rather, what this is outlining is guidance for when you do decide to cue, here are the principles. And when you do decide to debrief, here are the principles. We do not want to suggest that you have to be talking before every single movement action. In fact, we know, generally speaking, as someone becomes more skilled, they have less dependence on us, and the things they're trying to improve become lesser and lesser or more and more finite. And thus the amount of cueing and information we need to provide also fades and narrows. It's a natural consequence of someone learning, especially if we want them to do what I like to call OTC, and that's own the change. And so what I want to emphasize is the habits around when you decide to cue and the habits around when you decide to debrief more than anything else. Now, we could say quite a bit here, but we're going to focus on these bookends of the short loop because arguably they have the greatest impact on the movement. The cue literally manifests as the athlete's focus. So arguably it is the most important phrase or set of words you use, and thus the most important verbal habit you have. And that debrief is ultimately meant to inform the cue. So by default, it closes the feedback loop to help you develop the next best cue, hence the reason we're also going to give it some airtime today. So as I'm saying, the cue and the debrief are the 2 most important communication moments and arguably the 2 most important communication habits. Think of these literally as habits like nutrition, like sleep, and any other habit, your morning routine. These are habits no different. Okay. The objective, and I love that it was pointed to earlier in the chat function with creating understanding. The objective is to create shared meaning and to do so by shifting from a monological approach to a dialogical approach. Rather than broadcasting as a one-way street, we make this a 2-way conversation. And so we're going to look at how we can do these two things better, how we can engender better shared meaning, and how dialogue rather than monologue as a principled approach to communication will help me get there. So shared meaning, what is it? When does it happen? What am I talking about? Well, shared meaning emerges, right? It shows up, it comes out naturally when an athlete's understanding leads to a desirable shift in skill, performance, and learning. So I think one of the first comments in the chat was that the athlete understands and it helps them ultimately learn and move better, that understanding bridges into outcome and performance. That's exactly what, as practitioners, we are chasing. Shared meaning means they get it, but they don't just get it intellectually. Right? Dramatic pause. They don't just get it intellectually. Because if they only get it intellectually, what happens? Well, you get that thing of, hey, coach, I know what to do, WHAT. I just don't know how to do it. And so our language is only as good as its transferability into motor action. How can we turn sound waves into neural impulses that get the person to move better? That's the challenge, and that's ultimately the heartbeat of shared meaning in our context. And so shared meaning is actionable understanding. Can they take their understanding of your words and physically do something with it? That's what wakes me up in the morning and keeps me up at night. How do we get better at this? And this is ultimately what I am chasing with every single interaction I have with an athlete on the pitch. Okay, so let's start to unpack this and let's do it in a fun, interesting way. I don't think we did this exercise as a group last time, but even if we did, it's worth repeating. So let's make a bet, okay? We are going to go ahead and COVID-free transport everybody on this call to Las Vegas, okay? And we are going to give you two movements, a 10-meter sprint and a standing broad jump. And for each of those movements, kind of like picking a horse, you are going to perform that movement using one of 4 cues. And so you'll do 4 sprints and you'll do 4 standing broad jumps. And with each of those, you're going to have a different focus, a different address in the GPS, a different lens on. But before you do the sprint trials and before you do the standing broad jump trials, you're going to make a bet. You're going to bet which cue is going to allow you to sprint the fastest with ideally the best technique and jump the furthest with, again, the best technique. So with that context laid, let's see how we go. We're going to start with the sprint. So you show up to the MGM arena where the betting is taking place and you have your 4 cues. Okay, so your first rep, focus on rapidly extending your hips. So you're in the blocks, you got a 10-meter sprint, and your focus is purely centered on rapidly extending your hips, right? You get a bit of a rest. Now your next rep, okay? Focus on rapidly driving your legs back. Run it through your mental simulator right now as you listen to me. Okay, rep number 3, focus on rapidly driving the ground back. Focus on rapidly driving the ground back. And then finally, rep number 4, focus on rapidly driving the ground back as if to sprint up a steep hill. Focus on rapidly driving the ground back as if to sprint up a steep hill. So you would have read these 4 cues before you did the trials. You would have made your bet, and then you would have done your 4 repetitions, leaving the outcome where it is. Right now, place your bet. So in that chat function, write A, B, C, or D. Which cue would you use for yourself, right, to run the fastest 10-meter time? Okay, I'm going to give you a few seconds to do just that. So I see a C coming in. I see 3 votes for D. So we have 3 for D, more Ds, few Cs, and there's another D, another D. Okay. So let me add them up here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 Ds and 2 Cs. So what we see here is 7 of you have picked our analogy, right, to focus on rapidly driving the ground back as if to sprint up a steep hill. And 2 of you have just taken the one component of that is an external cue, right? C, rapidly driving the ground back. Nobody selected our internal cues, either A or B. So the bets have been placed. Let's now go to our second movement. Again, we are going to give you 4 cues, and you would have tried each of them on. So cue number 1, focus on firing your leg muscles. Cue number 2, focus on quickly extending your legs. Cue C or 3, focus on exploding away from the start line. And then finally D, focus on exploding out as if jumping from one building roof to the next. Think parkour style. So again, there's your 4 cues. Which one would you have bet on for yourself? So here again, we see the votes coming in. We have all D's so far, D, D, D. Beautiful. And I believe near, if not all, votes are in. And we have what appears to be unanimous decision for D. So once again, the analogy, the figurative language. And while the figurative language here contained in D, in both the sprint and the standing broad jump, is not literal, it is still an external cue. It's an analogical, figurative, external cue. And so you're going to find that when we talk about analogy and when we talk about external cues in terms of their benefit on movement performance, I'm going to talk about them as being equivalent, more or less, to one another. But what's really interesting is we kind of knew, especially with this group's background in this science, that likely internal cues were not going to be selected. But what I find continuously interesting, and in fact, I just finished a study with colleagues, so the data is unpublished, but we're writing the paper up right now. You align to the vast majority of individuals out there that we assessed in our own study, which there was, I think, 125 subjects. And over 90% of people either had a preference towards an external cue or an analogy. And what was interesting is there was a correlation between visual imagery and analogical preference, meaning the higher you graded yourself on your capacity for visual imagery, the more likely you were to self-select an analogy as your preferential cue for performing a movement. And so I think it's important that you, as a representative group of physios, do represent the athletes and patients you're supporting in your own selection patterns, because in that study, it was athletes as well as non-athletes of a collegiate age group. And so we see that when given the option, people intuitively gravitate to this external cue or an analogically facilitated external cue. Wonder why that is? Well, we're going to get to that here in a moment. So which type of cue, final intuition pump here, which type of cue would you want an athlete focusing on during competition? Again, would you think internal, external, or analogical? I'm going to venture a guess, chuck it in the chat function if you'd like. We're probably going to stay aligned to that external or analogy, as your intuition showed in our last 2 examples. So I shared this last time. And what's interesting is literally I received an email from Gabrielle Wolf today on a brand new paper that I'm going to explain here in a moment that confirms this. But at present, if you go online to PubMed and look with the search function of external focus and or internal focus, you're going to get about 205 papers back starting in 1998 with theoretical papers well before this pointing to the same mechanisms. And we find consistently that an external focus results in superior performance and learning. And this is the same for an analogy that promotes an external focus, even if it is figurative. And what's beautiful is over the last 3 to 4 years, Gabrielle Wolf and her student, the first named author on this paper, have just finished the most comprehensive meta-analysis to date on the external focus versus internal focus phenomenon. And what's beautiful about this paper is it already told us everything we know. With medium to high effect sizes, we are seeing that an external focus not only promotes better performance in the moment, but more importantly, better learning long-term, better transfer to other skills. And this is independent of skill type, skill level, gender, and age. And so what we're finding is this is a uniform phenomenon, but you know this intuitively. When I go to grab my empty Guinness glass here, I don't think head, shoulders, knees, and toes. I don't have to coordinate my shoulder, my elbow, and wrist, assuming I have normal neural function. I simply identify the outcome. The shape actually forms my hand, quite literally, and then inevitably I achieve that outcome in quenching my thirst. We know this intuitively. If we required internal focus to move better, how would we move so well pre-verbal? Ultimately, an external focus binds us, connects us with the environment via the task we're trying to move in. That is about as natural as movement comes. Unfortunately, internal focus causes us to retreat. But as I've said again and again, and I outline emphatically in my book, that is not a canceling of an internal focus. Rather, it is a recontextualizing of its purpose. And that is internal language is critical for coaching discourse when it comes to explaining what to do and what happened and what needs to change. It's just not very good, especially for complex movement, which is anything more than two joints, when it comes to knowing how to actually do that. So once again, I say with evidence behind us, reinforcing the fact that this is already intuitively baked into us, it is an external focus or an analogy that facilitates an external focus that we want to see showing up within our cue it portion of the coaching communication loop. Okay, so inevitably, we recognize, just to put a pin in this, your words become your athletes, your patients' inner thoughts and focus. Choose carefully. In the same way we talk about having representative training, we need to have representative mindset alongside that training if we want transfer. The amount of times I've heard people say, I'm going to give them an internal focus in training and promote an external focus when they're on the field. That's like saying, I'm going to only do leg press and leg extension to have you sprint. It does not hold, not in intuition, not in evidence. And so we need to be developing the mind alongside the body, because Descartes, in his error, they are inseparable. And so this is why, again, this information I'm preaching, hopefully to the converted, is so critical. So we had two major things we wanted to talk about in practice: creating shared meaning and moving from monologue to dialogue. So in our final 30 minutes, we're going to keep this fast and furious, but very practical. And so what I find interesting is, and it's beautiful when this foreshadowing works out. So many of the cues, in jest or not, offered in the chat function exercise at the beginning were analogical. They were analogies. You compared something the athlete was familiar with and might even get a laugh to something they're less familiar with, this nuanced aspect of a movement they're trying to learn or relearn. Also, almost to a person, near unanimously, outside of the two external cues that were chosen for the sprint, everybody picked the analogies for the sprint and the broad jump. And so there's something about analogy that is human, that is ancient, that is natural. You go to any pub, any coffee shop, sit around the breakfast table or the dinner table, we are storytellers. We always convey a concept through story. So we try to teach you a new idea via something you're already familiar with. And this is what is referred to as analogical reasoning. Analogy is also, by way of how our mind works, categorical. And that anytime I get a new piece of information, I analogize it to a category I already have. Like, oh, this rock can also be a chair. So that rock in that moment when I'm out in the wilderness and my legs are tired becomes analogized to something I can sit on, falling into the category we deem chair. So even the way our mind creates categories, by extension, is analogical in its nature. So analogy is as ubiquitous as breathing oxygen, as drinking water and eating food. And so it makes sense then that it should be the dominant and preferred form of communication when we are conveying anything, let alone in our case, movement. Just to show you how ubiquitous and common it is, I'm going to give you 3 questions. And again, if you're happy to play along, I simply want you to notate your answers in the chat box, just so I get a little bit of a sense of how you're traveling here. So first question, what does a bottle rocket have in common with a vertical jump? Second, what does a table have in common with a push-up? And then finally, what does a hammer have in common with a sprint or sprinting? So feel free to answer all, any of them, or none of them based on your own preference. But let me go through what I see, what I hear. Well, what is a bottle rocket? Like literally that firework that you put inside of an old school kind of glass Coke bottle. Well, it goes vertical fast. And that's exactly what we want to see with a vertical jump. And so there's both a speed and a directionality here that has relevance. They map, is the term, onto one another. What does a table have in common with a push-up? Well, in a push-up or a press-up, as we say over here, I'm trying to keep the body flat. I'm trying to keep it relatively stiff. And so in this case, I'm analogizing the trunk to a wood kitchen table, let's say. And I might even build on that analogy, telling them to, hey, keep your trunk stable like a table. I'm going to put a glass of water. Don't let it spill. And then finally, what does a hammer have in common with a sprint? Well, quite literally, if you look at the motion of the arm, whether the arm is analogized to a hammer, or in fact, you would imagine the person holding a hammer, we can talk about hammering back with the arms. We can talk about hammering back with the legs. Or we can even say, imagine the arms are hammers and the legs are nails, hammer them into the ground, giving a bit more systematic, right, connection of the whole body. And so whether or not you wrote down in the chat function, I would argue that something quite similar, assuming you're familiar with bottle rockets, tables, and hammers, sprints, press-ups, and vertical jumps. If you're familiar with these movement and these concepts, you will very quickly be able to access their relevance. But what I want to argue here is the following. You access that relevance first and foremost as a feeling, right? You feel what they have in common, and then you apply language to it. And that's the key. That's the secret sauce of an analogy. It's like a Trojan horse. If I give them the right analogy, all those soldiers inside the Trojan horse, that's like all that technical internal language we'd preferably like to convey or like them to understand physically. But it's wrapped up in a simple object, a simple visual like a horse that they can understand. And so learning how to curate and create analogies becomes, frankly, a secret weapon to get into the words that work. So let's start to get this analogical engine revving. Now, I would like you, if you're still on, to use the chat function here. Here's our hip hinge, our single leg RDL or single leg arabesque, whichever your preferred title is. Note some analogies you might use to teach this pattern, especially if you are trying to promote the hinge pattern. So try to share any of your go-to analogies that you use when you are teaching this pattern. And again, if you're tired from a long day, I totally get it. You don't have to share. I at least want you to reflect on it. Okay, what are some of your go-to analogies? Do you even have analogies that you use when teaching this movement? Okay, chat function is looking cold, so I'm going to keep going. So here's some examples. If I'm trying to promote this pattern of posture where I want them long, from head to heel, strong as steel, one meal deal, I want to see connection, I might give the analogy from head to heel, your body is a bungee, a band being pulled in both directions. I want you to lengthen that band as you go towards the ground. I might even use a similar analogy where I tell them, hey, I want you to focus on putting your footprint on the wall behind you. In both cases, I'm trying to naturally encourage this sense of creating tension. You might even refer to it as creating joint centration through length from head to heel. So this is a postural analogy. What about the lowering? Well, hey, I want you to imagine that you have a piece of chalk on your back heel, and there's a big red brick wall behind you. Draw a straight, thick, white chalk line up that wall. Notice how I take the time to tell the story. Some analogies are short, others take a little bit of explanation, but it's worth the investment. Because what we then see here is that leg is the first thing to rise, driving a more hip-dominant hinge, just like one would if we were to analogize this movement to a wheelbarrow. So this is quite effective. And then finally, what about the lifting? Coming up connected, or if it's a heavy weight, possibly with speed. I want you to imagine your sternum, your chest is chained to the ground. Even right now, feel this physically in your own body. Break the chain as you come up. You can imagine if you just tried to do this by extending the back first, intuitively, you know it would not work. So you start to feel that revving of the hips by way of this analogy. Again, assuming that I was clear in my description and people were familiar with chalk walls, chains, and bungees, these would transfer quite well as long as you are targeting the right movement error. So what we see here is analogies are quite intuitive, right? But it's a matter of being able to create them. That's what I hear from a feedback perspective as being the most challenging thing. But if you're not convinced, just one final statement to reinforce their value here, analogies literally invoke a virtual reality, right? That's why I kind of call it a virtual external cue or a figurative external cue that allows us to imagine what it would be like to be a band, to have chalk on the heel with a wall behind us, to be chained to the ground, and then act as if. My friends, this is Simon Says. Right? Look at the mirroring capacity of us just generally when we watch a demonstration, or a child when they're learning to sample the various human or animalistic traits of acting like mom, dad, doctor, or dog. We are brilliant at it. An analogy by way of language promotes the same visual engine and our ability to act as if, bringing that virtual reality into real life. And so this is why they're so powerful and intuitively attractive to us. Now, as I already mentioned, the most challenging part of this for most individuals is creating analogies. Now, in my book, right, warning for book plug here, in my book, I have an entire chapter on analogy. And I do go much deeper into a model that shows you what the DNA of an analogy is in the spirit of helping you to create them. But what I find is a shortcut to the same outcome are understanding the categories of analogies. And that there are 3 different categories of analogies as far as I can tell. And once you understand these categories, you're going to find it far easier to use them to pump your creativity and come up with analogies on the fly, or at least in preparation for a session. So we can think of these first 2 analogies or 2 analogy categories as importing and exporting the athlete's body. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So the first one is what I refer to as the scenario-based analogy. So this type of analogy invites the athlete or patient to imagine performing a movement in a scenario that, if real, would promote the desired pattern. So in the mind's eye, you're asking them to export themselves to some other proverbial scenario that, if real, if in reality was in fact happening, would force the pattern of movement with no thought from the athlete because of the nature of what the scenario of what the environmental context is offering. So here's some examples. If I'm trying to get more vertical, calm body posture in a pull-up, I want you to imagine you're hanging off a wall or hanging off a cliff's edge. Pull straight up. You might even ask the question, if you're trying to pull up on a wall, what's your body going to need to do during the pull-up? And they're going to tell you it's going to have to stay straight. So even if you want to kind of probe their understanding, easy to do when delivered in a question format. Another option, that pesky single leg squat, always shifting to the non-stance leg. I want you to imagine you're standing on a cliff's edge as you're squatting down and back to a bench or box, let's say. You might even go as far as putting a piece of tape on the ground to make it visually that much more real to the person. And then finally, for posture, I want you to bow over the bar as if bowing to an opponent in an MMA or a karate match. And so in this case, they're imagining what it would be like to bow to a person as they are hinging down. So as I said earlier, they are exporting themselves, mentally speaking, traveling to this scenario, and then acting as if it was real to generate the desired movement pattern. So that's category number 1, scenario-based analogy. For time, I'm not going to ask you to write any of them down, but if you are compelled, please feel free to put any examples yourself in the chat function as I'm going. Second option here, then, category is a constraint-based analogy. For those of you even lightly familiar with the skill acquisition motor learning research, you are familiar with this term of a constraint, a physical constraint that I manipulate around or about the athlete / patient in the spirit of pushing them towards a desired movement option. Well, the beautiful thing is we can do this just as easily mentally as we can physically. In fact, every physical constraint you can literally use in real life can be converted or transferred into an analogical constraint. And so this type of analogy invites the athlete to imagine a physical constraint that, if real, would promote the desired pattern. So in this case, they are mentally importing some physical constraint, some object typically, into their immediate surrounding, mentally speaking, and acting as if it were really there. So here I might use my chain. Chain and band is a common one. Imagine the ball is chained to the ground. Break the chain as you explode up. Again, just feel this analogy. Just use the visual. Don't even need to worry about the words. Just feel the visual. And you already start to see the kinetic chain connection that would be required to perform this movement if real. Right? Balancing something on the body is one of the most common mental and physical constraints we can use. So imagine there's a book on top of your head. A swimming coach, an artistic swimming coach, that I was speaking to yesterday, said, imagine that you have a tray with 10 bottles of champagne after winning the championship. So whatever tickles your fancy, as long as they can balance it on a body part, and that body part should remain stable, it's a beautiful example of a constraint-based analogy. And then finally, let's say for a front squat, we want good vertical motion with limited transfer forward or back. Imagine that there is a wall in front of you and behind. You are sandwiched in between, squat straight down and up. And again, you can position these as questions. If there was a wall in front of you and behind you, show me what your squat would look like. In fact, I find that to be a less controlling, forceful way to deliver analogy. It promotes a bit more autonomy and a bit more creativity, which fundamentally is the purpose of a constraint in the first place. And then finally, an object-based analogy. This type of analogy invites the athlete or patient to literally move as if transformed into an object, with characteristics that support the desired pattern. So literally getting tall like a tree. I am transporting my body into tree form. I keep your body flat like a wooden kitchen table. That's an object-based analogy. Hey, I want you to imagine from head to heel, you are a chain being pulled in either direction, or take the slack out of the chain. Right? My body's not literally a chain, but I can act as if. Importing, there's that word again, the physical characteristics onto my bodily movement. And then finally, load the springs, explode as if the springs were to release all their energy vertically. Especially when we're working with youth and kids, all of your animal analogies are categorically similar to what I refer to object-based analogies. So you can either export the body to a scenario that promotes the movement, import something to the immediate surrounding, right, that supports the movement, or transform the body into an object with the materialistic characteristics that you feel will promote the movement. Having these three categories loaded up will make it far easier for you to identify analogies on the spot if you don't currently find it to be an easy skill to express. So, last section now. We talked about building shared meaning, right? We build shared meaning when they understand what we say and find it easy to action in real life. That literally is what analogy gives us. The second key strategy, as I've already modeled with the offering of using questions to deliver the analogy, is moving from monologue to dialogue, to actually involving and inviting your patient in the learning process, tapping into their narrative, using your interpersonal communication skill set to mine their experiences and their preferences via a conversation and reuse that raw material and repurpose it through your cues to help them move better and understand their movement better. And so this is what I refer to as co-creating cues, or cue collaboration. And I want to finish with 4 simple strategies that I use again and again and again to model conversation, to model dialogue in pursuit of the words that work. Okay, so the very first strategy related to this is listen. When you are talking and inviting the client or patient to talk, listen for common words, phrases, and preferences, things they go back to again and again and again. Take note of their work, their life experiences, their sporting background, and their interests. You can ask about these things directly or more be an active listener, collecting these nuggets as they present themselves naturally. Pay attention to how they like to receive information. Are they a kind of person that says, keep it short and simple, let me try, or give me detail and background before I begin? So step number 1 to start to influence and have good, rich dialogue is to understand the person in front of you. This is built on an active listening skill set. So the practicality here is if you do this, it allows you to use familiar language and relatable experiences to craft your cues and analogies. We literally pumped your intuition for this fact already and demonstrated it hopefully in the last section. The second strategy then is to mirror. What do I mean by mirror? Well, after offering a cue to a client or patient, you can ask, what are you going to focus on? Or what does this cue mean to you? Or put this cue into your own words. So you take the first crack at offering the cue or the analogy, but then you ask them one of these questions, if not immediately, during the debrief. And so I want to show you what this looks like in an actual dialogue. So how do we mirror communication? So here's the coach. On your next set of goblet squats, I want you to focus on sitting your hips behind the kettlebell, emphasizing notably here the kettlebell. So Nikki, what does that cue mean to you? Nikki, well, you want me to push my hips back as I squat down to the floor. Albeit subtle, I want you to notice that Nikki uses a slightly different collection of words than the coach. So what the coach then does, seeing that Nikki understands the cue and the meaning was maintained, says exactly and mirrors her words. Focus on pushing back as you squat down to the floor. So I do this again and again and again habitually, that I give a cue, especially if it's the first time they're using it, I'll ask them to put it in their own words or what does it mean to you? And if they come back with a slightly modified version verbally, but it doesn't destroy the meaning of the cue, I use their cues. I use their words because it came from their own language locker, right? So the take home, if meaning is maintained, that's the key here, mirror your patient's language by modifying the original cue to match their phrasing of it. This is a deadly simple strategy, but one that you can use and automatically starts to bring the client and patient on the journey. Okay, these are going, as you hopefully will be able to tell, in, let's say, the order of experience, meaning the more experienced the patient is with what you're teaching, the more advanced co-creation strategy you can use. So strategy number 3 is choice. Here, you're offering a selection of cues to choose from. You can do this when you're teaching a movement for the first time, but certainly as they become more familiar with the movement and you want to give them a bit of controlled ownership, this choice option is a brilliant one. So you might say, which of the following do you prefer? Which of the following will help you achieve X? Such as, which of the following cues do you think will help you stay long during your hinge, during your single leg RDL? Which of the following makes the most sense to you? Which of the following feels the best? Any of these questions, as well as ones you can come up with, are on offer here. So let's give an example. So providing choice. Coach, Nikki, we're upping the weight on your kettlebell swing today. Which of the following cues would you prefer to focus on to maintain our speed emphasis? So I give a very focused question that doesn't leave a lot to imagination, helping them to be precise in what cue they think will help. And so literally what we're doing with Nikki is exactly what you did earlier. We're giving you some options. You run them through your preference filter and see what comes out the other end. Me as a coach, I'm curating cues that I know I'm uniformly happy with. So whip the kettlebell at the wall or the front wall, to be specific. Rip the kettlebell away from the back wall. Again, they mean the same thing, but coming from two different directions. Or snap and stand tall. Again, I'm likely not giving these choices unless Nikki has a certain level of competence with the movement already. Nikki, ooh, I think I'm feeling B today, coach. Beautiful. And every time I give this question and these options, those preferences start to build on one another. And I get a general sense, hey, this person likes a bit more external cueing. This person likes a bit more analogy. This person needs a bit of internal language to avail of the benefit of the external cue and the analogy. This creates a beautiful, rich dynamic between you and the patient that involves them, prompts and pumps motivation, but giving you access to the words that work, leaving less to the imagination on your end. Right? So the key takeaway, providing choice, we know this, and I could give you an entire presentation on just this fact. Providing choice supports motivation, drives attention, and helps the coach understand the patient's preferences. Okay, final one, and this is really the one that you're going to use with the athlete or the client, the patient that understands the movement. So the final step, right, the transcendent step is to allow creation on their end to occur. So in this case, you are going to describe what aspect of technique needs to change. You might even ask them to describe what aspect of technique needs to change and co-create the cue with the patient. And so, hey, what do you think you can focus on to achieve better alignment in your vertical jump, to get a better hinge, to get a better push during your extension, to get lower during your tackle, right? Or possibly to stay long during your single leg RDL, to get more power during your vertical jump. So you position a question that prompts a specific aspect of technique, and you allow them to start to ruminate around what might work. For the advanced person, you might ask them to identify the area of change and the cues. And you're using guided questioning to inevitably get them to where you think they need to be. It's a win-win. And so ultimately use this strategy with moderate to advanced patients, clients, or athletes to drive, once again, motivation, attention, and there's that phrase, beautifully, poetically, shared meaning, which is what it is all about. So with that, my friends, I believe we are here with 2 minutes to spare. Again, if you want a bit more background, all open source, it's thelanguageofcoaching.com. Questions for me, info@thelanguageofcoaching.com. And if you want the fresh hits, it's at Nick Winkleman. Mutchy and everybody, thank you again for inviting me tonight. That's me.
Nick, thank you. We've gone straight back into the classroom here to open up channels for any kind of questions. I've got one to kickstart proceedings, and I guess it's around your overall sort of language and cueing. Do certain cues transfer beyond the gym towards certain individuals in an organization? So, for example, maybe the CEO or a head of performance. So rather than just an exercise based strategy, do you have anything in terms of structure and process type questions?
Now, take me one level deeper, Mutchy, on this. Is this in terms of getting common language across an organization?
Shared meaning is something you've talked about a couple of times there. You've pretty much ended it. Would you say that there are ways of using cues to sort of establish shared meaning within a structure, within the process of dealing with HOP or a CEO?
Yeah, I think definitely. You know, what we're ultimately trying to do is pursue shared meaning and ultimately define it in such a way that it shortcuts us to it time and time again, such that early on, when we're interacting with someone on, let's say, the values of the organization, you know, someone might say, well, a value for me is integrity. And you might ask the question, well, what does integrity look like to you? This is what it looks like to me. And inevitably, you create that shared meaning. You understand what each other means. And maybe then you use that word integrity. And so integrity now becomes the shortcut, the prompt to that shared meaning, that shared understanding. The critical piece is the work that must go in conversationally, dialogically, to make sure that we understand this thing. I see this and I say, right, it's a cup. Well, you say it's a pint glass. Well, we have to get to the point where we agree as to what this is. Once we agree to what this is, we can then give it a label. We call that a word or a phrase or a mantra. And all that does is it shortcuts us to a shared level of understanding, and ideally a shared understanding that prompts a behavior, habit, and emotional state. That's what conversation is. The key is to pursue it. We could talk about a lot of strategies, but the key is, am I listening and am I continuing to seek to understand until I do so? And I know that's a bumper sticker answer, but I believe that's where the work begins and ends.
Oh, that's super. That's really, really useful as a means for us to potentially have a common term or phrase that we can actually get to the nub of certain questions. And I think that's genius. I haven't seen any other questions unless anyone flags a question just now. There's a few comments that come in. Just what a follow-up to March, really clear, but offering some real takeaways moving through this week. I know that the session earlier in the year just provoked so much positivity, and I know a lot of people have been using your cues and the art of language in a slightly different and nuanced way now in the gym and out in the track and in the artificial. So thanks again from us, Nick, for coming in. Oh, I've got a question here from Hannah. Sorry, I was going to cut her off for the second time today. Do that. Hannah, come ask, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a quick question about an injured athlete. So we said about looking at an external focus being better in terms of performance. But when you have an injured athlete and we're obviously helping them recover, do you tend to find yourself maybe looking at more of an internal focus for some of those athletes, or would you still try and look at more of an external focus for a big skill?
Yeah, if you go to the work of Anne Benjamins and Ali Gokler, who are both out of a university in Amsterdam, I believe, or certainly the Netherlands, they would say no. In that there is no concrete, consistent, robust evidence that suggests that an internal cue, even for someone recovering from an injury, is beneficial. In fact, it's quite the contrary. That an external focus would still, whether it's prevention or return, promote not. And when I say performance, I mean in the broadest sense. Certainly, it could be jump performance in terms of distance, but equally the qualitative, technical aspect, kinematically speaking, of movement itself. And again, Ali Gokler and Anne Benjamins would be two authors you would want to seek out to understand some of their great work on this space. I think, though, if you're doing isolated muscle activation, or you're doing single joint type work, or you are trying to explicitly promote a greater electrical current, not chasing necessarily efficiency of that electrical current to one part of the body, then evidence would say an internal cue could be your friend in that regard. The second you are pivoting to coordination at any level being the key area, and you're trying to promote that coordination across more than one joint, then an external cue is going to be the key. The other piece is, especially with analogy, if you have people who are in a pain cycle, you know that no longer that pain doesn't represent itself in terms of the tissue healing, meaning they should be able to do it, yet they still have a level of central pain. In therapy for trauma, now I'm talking here psychological trauma rather than physical, but I'm quite certain it carries over. They will use metaphor, imagining yourself as someone else or somewhere else to decouple the person from the pain. And so this is an area I would love to investigate more myself, but I think analogy also promotes that as well. So I think all things point to getting still to the external cue, to getting to the analogy. But Hannah, I want to be very clear for everybody else. We can still use internal language to discuss what's going on. There's no issue with that. But it's trying to convert that into a how message. And a how message tends to be better scripted through an external cue or an analogy.
Thank you.
I'm glad that the last call for questions brought something else around language and into some of our population should be injured as well as performance. Super stuff, Nick. Positivity around already in socials about this, and then obviously people have just copied into the chat function there. They appreciate, and I think it's really built on what you've done earlier in the year. So I'm pretty certain it's not the only time you're going to be speaking to us, because it's fantastic and it's something we can take away every day. So my final thanks to you, Nick. Thanks for people for staying with us this long and for enjoying. We will, of course, put this into the members restricted zone for you to follow up on some of those great slides. But finally, Nick, appreciate your time tonight, and you've had a busy day in meetings as well, so thoroughly appreciate it.
Listen, thank you all the best. Like I said, reach out if you have any questions. Cheers.
Cheers. Good night, everybody.